It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. Last time, we witnessed the lonely and tragic life of Aghora, the second Metabaron, the first of his line to try and escape the destiny laid out for him by his ancestors, only to be manipulated into fulfilling that destiny anyway. We take up the story in the literal aftermath of his self-imposed demise, as well as that of Oda Honorata, and now we cover the tale of his infamous son, Steelhead. Having collected a literally galactic-sized fortune for his victory against his father, and thus saving the galaxy from the Pythagorean invasion, Steelhead departed without fanfare. Apart from his monetary reward, he went unacknowledged as the savior of the galaxy. But that didn't matter to him, because he knew how pathetic and venal the Imperial Court was. All he had to do was wait for the next great crisis, and they'd come crawling on their knees to him, begging for aid. He was not long in being proven right. From the rift in space-time created by his epic duel with Aghora, emerged vampiric brain-eating space worms that descended upon the hapless ships of the Empire as its crews celebrated the great victory over the Pythagoreans. Being not of this physical plane, they simply passed through the hulls of the many warships and consumed the brains of their luckless victims, including the Emperor and Empress. Now sole ruler of the galaxy, and knowing of no one else who could stop this menace, Emperoress Janice Janna appealed to Steelhead for help. She offered the great cyborg warrior money, but Steelhead had already plenty of Kublars. What he wanted were honors. He wished to be awarded the title of Supreme Metabaron and, most coveted honor of all, the Medal of High Nobility, which would effectively make him one of the most elite members of the Galactic Empire. Janice Janna was more than happy to accept these terms, with a caveat. To be awarded the Medal of High Nobility required a unanimous vote from all the representative leaders of the great fiefs of the Empire. And while most of the imperial nobility was venal or corrupt enough to go along with this, there was one man noble enough to refuse to give his vote to such an unscrupulous creature as Steelhead willingly. Don Nicanor Rosamel de Roja, president of the ecologically minded Troglo-Socialic Federation, a man of integrity and principle. The only way to remove his opposition would be to eliminate him, which of course Steelhead had no compunctions against. The deal having been agreed to, Steelhead immediately flew off to close the interspatial breach. Naturally, since his head was full of nothing but circuitry and wires, the vampire worms found nothing to feed upon and thus could not oppose him. Steelhead sealed the interspatial breach with ease, and thus severed from their home dimension, the vampire worms disintegrated soon thereafter. Now all that remained was to deal with Don Nicanor. Luckily, in keeping with their obsessive love of nature and rejection of the teachings of the Techno-Church, the Troglo-Socialic Federation was remarkably primitive by galactic standards. Its primitive defenses no match for the technology and ruthless intellect of Steelhead. Floating silently through the air on a hang glider, Steelhead caught Don Nicanor in the midst of his morning meditation. In keeping with the ecological traditions of the Troglo-Socialic Federation, the president was engaged in dawn meditation in the branches of an immense Halyers tree, the oldest known tree in the universe. Its branches filled with the sweet angelic songs of the Dayuka birds that called it home. Steelhead naturally thought nothing of this as he used his powerful meta-weapons to destroy the president and the tree. With no one to cast an opposing vote, Steelhead went to the Golden Planet to receive the Medal of High Nobility. But then, an interruption. Don Nicanor was dead, but he had a daughter, Doña Vicenta Gabriela de Roca. She denounced the corrupt emperoress and the venal court that would grant such a high honor to an unprincipled murderer like Steelhead, throwing down before them a fragment of bone that was all that was left of her father, and a charred limb that was all that remained of the Halliers tree. She also cast her vote in opposition to awarding the Medal of High Nobility, thus denying the unanimity needed to give Steelhead the honor he so desired. As for Steelhead, she cursed him as inhuman, a half-machine monster who would sire no descendants, and thus his clan would die with him. She then drew a hyper pistol, not to kill Steelhead, for she knew he was invincible, but to kill herself, as a gesture of principled defiance against the corruption of the Empire. But Steelhead, angered by her insults, used his superhuman reflexes to stop her from killing herself, and vowed that he would indeed prove her wrong and produce descendants. Doña Vicenta mocked the idea. The previous Metabarons had been born to couples deeply in love with one another, the seeds of great passion. But Steelhead, a cyborg with a metal skull, had never and could never know such an emotion. Furious at her defiance, Steelhead vowed on the spot that he would discover how to feel love. He would prove himself worthy of the Medal of High Nobility, and he would not rest until he saw the day where she got on her knees before him in penance and cast her vote in favor of awarding the Medal of High Nobility. Until then, she was to go back to live on Philodendra, her homeworld, and he charged the Imperial Court with ensuring her safety. If she died before he returned from his quest to discover love, the Supreme Metabaron vowed not only to massacre the entire Imperial government, but to destroy the Golden Planet itself. And so began Steelhead's great quest, to discover how a cyborg like him could experience love. He scoured all the archives and repositories of knowledge in the galaxy to no avail, for none of the texts that he found could provide him any insight into the emotion that he sought. Even Terra Prima, birth world of humanity, held no answers. The tomes there were so ancient that they simply crumbled to dust before he could even read them properly. But at last, a solution presented itself one day when the little robot Tonto intercepted a strange transmission. The transmission of a man's voice reciting poetry in real time, even though the art of poetry had apparently died out 5,000 years ago. With Tonto's help, Steelhead was able to get a lock on where that signal was coming from. The galaxy's edge, the most hostile region of inhabited space known to man. They also discovered the identity of the man reciting the poetry, Zaran Kreleza, the last of the poets. Steelhead became convinced that this was the answer to his quest, for surely if anyone could teach him what love was and how to feel it, it would be a poet. After 6 months of searching along the galaxy's edge, the metabunker arrived at the world from whence Zaran's poetry was being transmitted. It was a desolate world of gale-force winds and near-constant acid rains, crawling with vicious predators like the infamous pachydermic jellyfish. But Steelhead was undeterred. Donning a multi-ton exoskeleton, the Metabaron braved the acid-scoured, monster-infested wastes, finally arriving at the residence of the last poet, a great, seemingly impregnable fortress. As he stood before the gate, the voice of Zaran Kreleza addressed Steelhead and offered him a challenge. Of all the predators of this world, the deadliest was the giant octo-tiger. Steelhead was to defeat the beast, but without killing it and with only one weapon, a bow with no arrows. If Steelhead failed or resorted to violence to slay the beast, then the last poet, weary of his long, lonely existence, would activate the self-destruct sequence built into his fortress and destroy himself along with the planet. Because after all, in the Johto-verse, there is no kill like overkill. Seeming to find no alternative, Steelhead accepted the challenge. At first, though, it seemed hopeless. What could he do with a bow with no arrows against a monster as large and savage as the Octo-Tiger? The only advice the poet would give him were the words, "Return to yourself to where consciousness fades." And so Steelhead searched inside himself, and intuition provided a solution where logic had failed. He began to pluck the bowstring as if it were a musical instrument, and, miraculously, music did indeed soothe the savage beast, and the Octo-Tiger eventually fell asleep. Thus Steelhead had won his first victory without the use of force, and Zaran Kurleza welcomed him into his dominion. The Metabaron entered only to discover that the last of the poets was nothing more than a disembodied head. In the pursuit of expressing love through verse, Zaran Kurleza had divested himself of the rest of his fleshly existence. As a result, though, he had never experienced the carnal aspect of love, and this was something that apparently he regretted. Thus, he proposed a solution to Steelhead, that the two become one. Zaran's head be fused to Steelhead's body. Their individual egos would vanish, and their identities would be combined into one being, one that possessed the strength of a titan and the soul of a poet. Thus, from a certain point of view, Steelhead would indeed learn how to experience love. The Metabaron accepted, and after a techno-fantastic surgery that again made nothing of autoimmune rejection or genetic incompatibility, the head and the body were combined, and a new being emerged, calling itself Melmoth. What's more, Melmoth revealed to an astonished Tonto that he was also madly in love with Doña Vicenta Gabriela de Roja, and was determined to make her his wife and carry on his glorious clan. The robot rather reasonably pointed out that that was hopeless, given that he was technically still Steelhead, and thus still the man who had murdered her father and destroyed the sacred Halyers tree and its Diuca birds. Hell would freeze over before she chose to love him. But Melmoth, no doubt thanks to his poet head, was convinced that love could conquer all. The first step would be to repair the faults of Steelhead, which meant trying to find another Halyers tree, arguably the rarest living thing in the galaxy. But at last he found it, on the planet Gizane, described as the paleo asshole of the universe, populated only by thousands upon thousands of savage, deadly macromites. If Melmoth was going to get to the tree, he was going to have to kill them. Of course, possessing the body of Steelhead and all of the weapons that the meta bunker had to offer, that was no real challenge. Within 2 hours of landing on the planet's surface in a set of power armor, he proceeded to massacre the entire macromite population at a rate of 10 per second. The Halyers tree and its Diuca birds were lifted up into the meta bunker and transplanted to Philodendra, just in time for dawn and the awakening of Doña Vicenta. The new leader of the Troglosocialic Federation awoke suddenly to the song of the Diuca birds that she'd thought were long dead, and to find that her guards, and indeed the entire army of Philodendra, had been rendered asleep. And there in the distance, its golden boughs greeting the dawn, was the Halyers tree, in the same spot where it had been when Steelhead had destroyed it along with her father, Don Nicanor. Even after a little robot appeared and told her that it was a gift from his master, a token of love for her, Vicenta continued to believe that she was in a dream. And so amidst the golden boughs of the Halyers tree and the angelic song of the Diuca birds, Melmoth and Doña Vicenta met and did exactly what you might expect them to do, because again, this is a Jodorowsky comic. Only after they'd done the deed did she ask him his name, and reacted with horror upon learning that Melmoth was indeed a composite being of Zaran Kurleza, the last poet, and Steelhead, the supreme Metabaron. She accused him of seducing her without revealing his name, to which I can only say, "Lady, you're the one who shagged him without asking." Of course, cue the melodrama and the weeping and the sobbing and the "oh, you are the man I love and the man I hate, oh, the emotional agony." At which point, Melmoth, unable to bear the suffering of his beloved, offered her a pistol with which to kill him. If he was the source of her distress, the best cure would be to eliminate it. But Vicenta could not bring herself to kill Melmoth, and instead tried to kill herself. But that would never do. And since Melmoth was at least in part Steelhead, he possessed all the weird abilities of the Shabda Oud as taught to him by Honorata. With superhuman speed, he deflected the bullet so that it only stunned and knocked out Doña Vicenta instead of killing her. He then placed her in cryostasis while he sought a solution to the problem. If restoring the Heller's tree and the Dayuka birds were not enough to make amends for Steelhead's crimes, there was only one other way that might do it. Restore Don Nicanor, her father, to life. Retrieving the skull fragment that was all that was left of the former president of the Troglossocialic Federation, Melmoth scanned the piece of bone molecule by molecule until, miraculously, he discovered a single cell that was still alive, and from it created a clone of Doña Vicenta's father. With this, at last, despair was replaced by love. Bitterness gave way to reconciliation. And now Doña Vicenta wanted nothing more than to marry Melmoth and bestow upon him the medallion of the high nobility. However, Don Nicanor's body was fully restored, but there was the question of his mind and his memory. It had to be tested. And so the two lovers arranged for Don Nicanor to give a speech at the presidential palace. And indeed, the restored Troglossocialic president performed as expected. His words and behaviors were just like the original. It seemed that Don Nicanor was fully restored, and his daughter rushed eagerly to embrace him. But unfortunately, Don Nicanor's memory had not fully returned to him. He saw the love in this young woman's eyes and felt love for her, but did not remember that she was his daughter. And so he deceived himself into thinking that he loved her in a more biblical way, and in fact tried to rape her once they were alone. Fortunately, Melmoth intervened, but Don Nicanor, gripped by passion, ordered his men to murder the impertinent mercenary who stood between him and his woman. Melmoth, of course, could have turned them all to red paste with ease, but Doña Vicenta begged him not to. This was, after all, still her father and her people. Escape was equally impossible, for Don Nicanor would surely pursue them. And so Doña Vicenta bravely approached her father, asking him what it was about her that he loved. "Your soul," he said. "Where is my soul? In your eyes." And so Doña Vicenta gouged out her own eyes and gave them to her father. And of course, it was at this moment that Don Nicanor's memory was fully restored to him, and he collapsed in a mixture of horror, grief, and shame at what he'd almost done. Still, it seemed that otherwise all had ended well. Don Nicanor made the vote unanimous, and so Melmoth did indeed receive the Medal of High Nobility. And soon thereafter, he joined his beloved Doña Vicenta in holy paleo marriage, though during the ceremony, the bride wore a thick veil that she would not remove. Afterwards, the happy couple consummated their nuptials in the traditional castle of the de Roja family during the night in the midst of a summer storm. But alas, at the literal climax, a flash of lightning revealed a terrible truth. Doña Vicenta's eyes had been replaced with crude, ugly cybernetics, installed by Tonto, incidentally. This effectively caused the death of Melmoth, in a figurative sense. After he stormed out of the nuptial chambers, effectively abandoning Doña Vicenta, the two aspects that had combined to create him, Zaran Kurleza and Steelhead, began to war with one another in their shared mind. As it turned out, both the poet and the warrior had been a little sneaky, and before they had fused together into one being, had stored aspects of their original identity and personality in circuitry, Zaran's built into his head and Steelhead's into his chest. So technically, the two halves of Melmoth's nature had not really disappeared. Zaran, the poet, could not stand the sight of any ugliness, let alone that of Doña Vicenta's eyes, which is why, among other things, he almost kicked Tonto to pieces, and refused to see his new wife ever after. For once in his life, Steelhead seemed to be the more virtuous side here. He insisted that Zaran take responsibility, because it was his side of their shared nature that Vicenta loved, his poetry and his gentle soul. But Zaran would have none of it, and so in a way became an even pettier jerk than Steelhead had ever been. While the two halves of the Metabaron argued with one another, events were afoot on Philodendra as a fleet under the command of the Techno-Church arrived to make a deal with Don Nicanor. Ever since Othon had revealed the existence of Epiphyte to the Imperial couple all those generations ago, anti-gravity technology in the Empire had been revolutionized. But, at long last, Marmala's native reserves were running low. Luckily, the Techno-Church had figured out a way to make artificial epiphyte from a substance called bikramin, and wouldn't you know it, Philodendra had bikramin in abundance. And so the Techno-Church's offer was as follows. The population of Philodendra would relocate to another world, and the Techno-Church would mine the planet for bikramin in order to keep anti-grav technology going. Naturally, the people of Philodendra would receive monetary compensation. Of course, this would mean the ecological destruction of the planet, which of course Don Nicanor would have nothing to do with. But the Techno-Church does not take no for an answer when it really wants something. The Techno-Armada was unleashed, and the citizens of the Troglossocialic Federation were made to regret their ideological decision to reject high technology. Philodendra's army was annihilated, Don Nicanor was killed. The only hope for the survivors was the Metabaron, who was currently at war with himself. All because apparently one half of him could not bear to be in the presence of a woman whom he deemed to be ugly. Which of course does beg a question. As we've just seen, Melmoth was able to clone an entire man from a single cell. Why couldn't he just clone Vicenta a new pair of eyeballs? Once again, I can only chalk this up to Jodorowsky favoring melodrama over logic. And so the argument went on. Zaran refusing to accept Vicenta or allow Steelhead to fight the Techno-Armada, as apparently ugliness and war were both offensive to his poet's sensibilities. Of course, Steelhead called him out as a hypocrite, a man who claimed to have dedicated his life to love only to reject it just because the woman was ugly now. Thus, backed into a mental corner, Zaran Kirleza, last of the poets, blew his own head off. So perished Melmoth. Steelhead was all that remained. Naturally, with his superlative skill, the Supreme Metabaron was able to outmaneuver the Techno-Armada and destroy the mothership. Without its guiding commands, the automated vessels began to fall out of the sky. But it was too late for Philodendra. The devastation was total, including the loss of the Hallers tree once again. There was nothing more that Steelhead could do for this planet, but there was a chance to at least salvage the situation. He ordered the Metacraft to make an interspatial jump, taking him, Tonto, and Vicenta to the planet of the Techno-Technos themselves for the purpose of kidnapping the Techno-Pope. No matter what bizarre weapons the Techno-Technos threw at him, Steelhead could not be bested, and he managed to kidnap Techno-Pope Amalek XII with ease. Back on Philodendra, the Techno-Pope remained defiant, reminding Steelhead that the Techno-Church still had plenty of ships to throw against him. But of course, Steelhead already knew that, which was why the next step in his plan was try and convince Vicenta that Philodendra was lost and that the only thing left to do now to save what little of her people were left was make as favorable a deal as possible. Once this was achieved, he broadcast to the entire galaxy knowledge of the existence of bikramin in the Troglossocialic Federation. Apparently the Techno-Technos had been keeping this fact a secret for themselves, and soon the Techno-Armada was surrounded by the ships of the Imperial Fleet, which was in turn surrounded by the ships belonging to all the great houses and magnates of the Empire, which was in turn again surrounded by fleets of pirates who waited to see what would happen next. Now that all the great movers and shakers of the galaxy were present, negotiations could begin. In the end, Doña Vicenta and Steelhead were able to get the major factions of the Empire to agree to a treaty. A mixed committee of representatives from all three Imperial factions would manage the distribution of bikramin, and in return, the people of Philodendra would receive a new world and massive monetary compensations for the loss of their old one. That done, the Techno-Technos, Nobles, and Imperial faction combined forces to wipe out the pirates and then the people of Philodendra were evacuated from their old world to a new one. Unsurprisingly, it was a very bleak and very sad moment. No more bleaker and sadder than for Dona Vicenta. Not only had she just lost pretty much everything she'd ever known and loved, thanks to Zaran Kurleza's suicide, the only thing that was left of the man she loved was Steelhead, the ruthless mercenary that she hated. And so, not long into her life on the new planet given to the refugees of Philodendra, Dona Vicenta fell ill, even as she was pregnant with child. 2, in fact, a boy and a girl. Alas, her illness had so weakened her that by the time the pregnancy was discovered, she would only be fit to bear one of them. Embittered by all that had happened to her, Vicenta believed that Steelhead would just save the boy and abandon the girl. After all, he needed a male heir to pass on the Castaka name. She would give him his heir and then allow herself to die in the aftermath of childbirth. But, thanks to his brief union with Zaran Kurleza, Steelhead had indeed learned to love, and despite Dona Vicenta's hatred for him, he loved her. And if he asked if she would live if he saved the girl instead, Vicenta said that she would, for she considered the boy to be the child of Steelhead, but the daughter of Zaran Kurleza, the poet whom she loved. And so, out of love, Steelhead did everything in his power to save the girl child. But as it turned out, it may all have been for nothing. The children were born as Siamese twins joined at the hip, and though the surgery to separate them was successful, it soon transpired that the girl literally had no brain in her tiny skull. But the boy had a brain, and so, without telling his wife, Steelhead transplanted the male brain into the female infant, and then ordered Tonto to store the carcass in a tiny stasis pod. Alas, it was all for nothing in the end. Dona Vicenta's constitution was simply too weak. She only had enough time to cradle her infant daughter in her arms before succumbing to her illness. Well, that's not entirely true. Desperate to prevent the final death of the woman he loved, Steelhead covered her in a substance called an omni-cryo-shroud and stuffed her in a stasis pod. There was nothing he could do to stop her from dying, but he was determined that she would at least live to see her child grow up. But this child, Aghora, with a woman's body and a man's brain, would grow up as Steelhead deemed fit, for he intended to mold her into the next Metabaron. Instead of a human wet nurse for Aghora, Steelhead captured a tarantula wolf, a genetically created monster that was arguably the most dangerous living organism in the galaxy. The thing had to literally be tied down so that the infant could feed at its teats. By age 5, Aghora had actually succeeded in taming the tarantula wolf, naming it Deianira, and it would be her faithful pet and war mount for years to come. At the age of 7, she underwent the test of pain endurance, having her hand literally fed through a deli slicer, having her entire right hand and part of her forearm shaved away bit by bit. And yet, in the truest traditions of the Castaka, Aghora shed no tears, and even asked for more, but this was proof enough for Steelhead that his daughter had the makings of a great warrior. And so he did not, in fact, go further than her forearm, and gifted her with a bionic hand. Steelhead then asked his daughter, "Do you wish to rise above the feminine body that holds your masculine mind? For that is the only way you may consider yourself a real man." Aghora said yes, and so her father surgically altered her chest so that her breasts would never grow. And so life went on for 9 more years. During this time, Aghora's body was implanted with all kinds of deadly weapons, enough, according to Tonto, to destroy a galaxy. Her rigorous training became even harsher, and her father even started sending her out on assignments in the field to demonstrate her prowess. Most famously, she spent 3 years as executioner on the prison planet of Kali Yuga, finding ways to kill the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy. Meanwhile, Steelhead was undergoing his own modifications. Unable to bear the emotional pain of losing Dona Vicenta, he had nearly his entire body replaced with cybernetics. At last, when Aghora turned 16, the fateful day arrived when parent and child would duel to the death to decide who would be the next Metabaron. Both met in the Hall of Weapons in front of Doña Vicenta's stasis pod and agreed to fight only with swords. The fighting lasted for 3 days, but it was only on the 3rd day, after striking a blow that should have killed her father, Aghora realized that victory was impossible. With his almost entirely metal body, Steelhead was immune to death by sword. But, as her great-grandfather Othon, first of the Metabarons, had said all those years ago, the mind is the warrior's greatest weapon. And Aghora knew her father all too well. With a blow of her sword, Aghora shattered the stasis pod containing Doña Vicenta, held in her state of near death for 16 years. She then put her mother out of her misery by cutting off her head. Suddenly, for Steelhead, the fight was forgotten. He decried his daughter for her actions, which is pretty rich given what he did to his mother in the duel with his father Aghora, and scrambled to try and save the woman he still loved, even with his cybernetic body. That distraction was all that Aghora needed. She couldn't kill Steelhead, but she could still stop him. She severed the pipes containing the cryo-shroud liquid, coating him in the substance, thus placing Steelhead in a state of stasis and ejecting him into the void of space. And so the fight ended, and a new Metabaron had come into the world. So ends the tale of Steelhead, denied humanity almost from the moment of his birth, forged into a ruthless warrior, bordering on monstrousness in fact, and yet a man who still managed to learn what it was to love, only to pay dearly for it, by seeing that love rejected by the woman who held his heart, and by having his own child use it against him to bring about his defeat. Next time, the story concludes with the penultimate member of the Castaka dynasty, Aghora the Father Mother. Until then,